All right, welcome back, everyone. I have to take the power podium position. All right. I hate to interrupt all the networking. It's great that so many of you know each other, making new friends. David, if you could settle down, thank you. Matt, oh, great group. For a Washington crowd, you're remarkably compliant. Thank you very much for all this. You must be used to a regulated kind of environment. So this is a longer panel. We have a change or two that I'd like to introduce you to first before we go through this. John O'Brien from CMS had been working diligently to be able to be here with us today, but for a variety of internal reasons, he will not be joining us as part of this panel. So we make apologies for that, as does he. But we have a distinguished group here. You'll also notice that this panel goes till 12:10. That's because we expect this to engender a great deal of discussion from all of you as well. We'll be taking a good number of questions. I'll point out again that we are webcasting this today, so as you ask questions, if you could come forward to the two microphones that are here, and to be courteous and give as many people a chance to ask a question as possible, please keep those, again, short and pithy, and the panel will try to do the same with their responses, that not everyone will answer every question. In fact, if you have some direction of who you'd like to ask the question to, please feel free to do that. And so we've talked about the potential, that these are exciting products, that the pipeline is rich, but perhaps not as overwhelming financially as people thought, but still very significant. And certainly, patient by patient, these are significant values that will be talked about. To now think about what are the financing challenges that such products might create for a variety of stakeholders, we have Steve Usdin with us, who is the correct me if I get this wrong, but I believe you're the senior editor and also do the health policy and regulation. Is that correct, Steve? Yeah. For BioCentury, which for those of you who don't know it, you should. We have an example of Steve's work out front, and it's just an incredible publication for this space, and Steve's quite expert at it. So Steve, I'll turn this over to your expertise.
Well, thank you. I'm going to be a little bit sideways so I can see you and so I don't get blinded by the lights. I want to start out, you know, Colin said that he was going to be the Grinch, but I've been doing this long enough, and I think all of us have, that, you know, the idea that you're going to have 40 to 50,000 people who are going to be cured of serious diseases is not Grinch-like. When I started out covering biotech, the aspiration was to have recombinant products that would replace naturally occurring proteins in the body, and that was about it. So I don't find the fact that we're going to have you know, potentially tens of thousands of people cured of diseases Grinch-like at all. I find it remarkable. Our panel, if he was the Grinch, our panel is kind of we're the whiners. So we're supposed to talk about what the financial challenges are. One of the things that I think that really distinguishes NewDigs is its ability and its desire to bring together really diverse stakeholders and to bring them into the room at the same time. And the other thing that really distinguishes NewDigs is that it has this tenacity then to bring them in and spend years homing in on solutions to problems and getting into the nitty-gritty. Because it's really easy to say in a glib sort of way, perhaps as a reporter, well, value-based pricing, you know, performance milestones and everything like that. It's really easy to say. When you get into the nitty-gritty of doing it, as we're going to talk about today, it's really a lot harder to make it really happen. And I think that's really the special thing that MIT NewDigs brings to it. And as I said, it also brings really brings the right stakeholders to the table. So, and this panel is emblematic of that. We have a patient advocate, we have a provider, we have someone who works with self-insured employers, someone who's run a state Medicaid program, and someone who works for one of the largest national payers. And those are really critical voices for this discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of you in turn, one at a time, very briefly, and then ask you an opening question and ask you to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about that question, and then throw it open for discussion among all of us. So I wanted to start with Joe Alvarnas, who's Vice President of Government Affairs and Senior Medical Director for Employer Strategy at City of Hope. City of Hope is a National Cancer Institute designated comprehensive cancer center and a world leader in the research and treatment of cancer, diabetes, and other serious diseases. So it's really, it's an interesting perspective. I think it's one that people don't usually think of, the fact that, that the providers are at financial risk in providing these curative therapies. So I wanted to start, gene and cell therapies. They combine what you could think of as a drug and a medical procedure. What are the challenges to providers to financing, for example, CAR T therapies?
That's a great question, and I think that our perspective is one born of having been in the CAR T-cell space since the 1990s and having treated our first patient in 2000. And I think the challenges are twofold. One is that, because I'm saying that we worked since the 1990s in developing these products and we're just now seeing commercial products come to market, there's an enormous amount of investment before the first commercial patient can ever be treated. And that money oftentimes is not recouped through standard reimbursement mechanisms. So there's enormous investment to get this right, to develop the technologies. The other challenge is that we've developed a system that's used to paying for things in certain ways. So ineffective therapies often fit into how we think about reimbursement because they fall into episodes that we typically think about: hospitalization, chemotherapy, and billing around that. Whereas a line item of $370,000, $470,000 really challenges how we look at things, and the optics are daunting. This has been a challenge with CAR T cells where, at least for now, on the inpatient space, we receive nothing in reimbursement from Medicare for product acquisition. And it's hard to begin an episode of care where on the first day that the patient gets admitted, you've already lost $373,000. We have to get past that level of unsustainability before we can think about the path towards making these things generalizable and delivered at scale to patients who need them.
That is a daunting thing to think about. Tim Brent is Senior Director for Business Development at the National Hemophilia Foundation. The National Hemophilia Foundation is dedicated to finding better treatments and cures for inheritable bleeding disorders and to preventing the complications of these disorders through education, advocacy, and research. So I really wanted to ask you, from the patient perspective, just like providers, there are financial implications to curative therapies and financial challenges that people don't usually think of. So can you kind of fill us in a little bit about what it looks like from the patient perspective?
Sure. With some of this is going to be both related to the therapy as well as unrelated because of the history of the disease. But one of the things that we're still grappling with as a community are the high deductible plans, the accumulator adjuster program that's out there. And for those of you that don't know the accumulator adjuster program, that was created by the PBMs and targeting the prescription medications and the copay cards of the manufacturers. So basically, in a nutshell, the accumulator is the out-of-pocket of the individual, to simplify it. And what happens then is when the person uses their copay card, it's allowed to be used, but instead of it going towards their out-of-pocket, it brings the out-of-pocket back down to zero again, as if they're starting over. And that has unintended consequences to that as well, because individuals within the community and their families, I mean, every year they are, maxing out of their out-of-pocket, hitting those maxes. That won't, separate from the therapy, that won't disappear because of the fact that, within this community, it also consists of HIV, hepatitis, also joint damage from years of bleeds. The gene therapy won't get rid of those things. So osteopenia with lessening of bone mass, as well as arthritis. So there's still a lot of financial challenges that would take place. And of course, as it relates to things like travel and going to the clinic visits and so forth, it really depends on your geographical location and of course the lost wages. In some cases, people can't afford it. There's just no way. Other cases, they have the opportunity to get in touch with other charities, other nonprofit organizations that can help out. And fortunately, it's a very close-knit community, and so you have family and extended family that is a great support system for those individuals to be able to help. And in some cases, some of the family members, in my experience, when I was on the treatment center side, we would see where some individuals, they would move in with their family members as well to cut costs, to be able to afford to handle costs like going several hours distance to get the clinic visits and so forth. So it's still going to be a challenge, but obviously there's a lot of exciting things happening with the gene therapy though, related to hemophilia.
And I want to come back later when we get into the discussion about the whole notion of co-pays and whether they even make sense for something like a curative therapy. So Bob Galvin is an operating partner at Equity Healthcare, a health management company that works with private equity firms and their portfolio companies to manage healthcare costs. But he's the former executive director for health services and chief medical officer at General Electric, which really, if you're thinking about it from an employer perspective, gives them a tremendous perspective. And I wanted to ask you, what are the challenges of curative therapies for self-insured employers? Do the kind of tools that self-insured employers use, like stop-loss arrangements, make sense? Will they work for something like a gene therapy? Will they make sense when we're talking about payment arrangements that might take place on milestone basis over years?
Yeah, I know it's a lot to talk about. So I'm actually an operating partner at Blackstone. I'm CEO of a company called Equity Healthcare. And what I do is talk to CEOs of businesses and take over their employee healthcare spending. So these companies are bought by this company called Blackstone and other private equity firms. My business goes in, says you're spending $50 million, $100 million on healthcare. Let me advise you about what I think you ought to do about it, and we take over those costs. So that's just by way of background. It just, employers aren't that kind of evident to folks in the room. So what we do is pay the insurers, who then kind of the providers and the manufacturers interact with. So about 160 million people are covered by insurers. About 100 million of them are self-insured. If you're large enough, you take your own risk, and that means you write your own benefit design. So the copay talk should be good coming up. And the rest of the balance are insured. So I'm on the self-insured side for this 100 million people. I've got about 75 companies. And I talk to CEOs and CFOs. And so I can tell you that it's an interesting mismatch between kind of how employers have approached healthcare costs and this, meaning these price tags. And so I think the system is kind of struggling to understand it. I think, and my chief clinical officer is on the task force, which has actually been very interesting. At the end of the day for us, I think this is a financing issue. And I think some of the performance-based annuities and some of the multi-year payments are not going to be consistent with how employers think about payment and how they're going to pay. So really what this is a classic risk issue. It is no different today that we cover hemophiliacs. We have catastrophic cases today, and yes, you're right. The way we deal with that is reinsurance, stop loss, some kind of pool. And so there is kind of, it becomes complicated if it were to be a prevalence much greater than we heard in the last talk. And it is an imperfect system to deal with these, because what happens is if kind of I'm in a company and I buy stop loss for the year and an employee of mine gets one of these illnesses, and I think these treatments are fantastic, and it's an $800,000 payment or $1 million payment, I have a stop-loss policy. I pay the first $200,000. The stop-loss reinsurer pays the rest. That works. That's how risk pools are supposed to work. The issue is, of course, that the next year the reinsurer comes back and says, if that employee is still there, I don't really want to do this anymore. And so it works ideally, I guess, if the patient keeps moving from reinsurer to reinsurer. So the way we deal with this is going to be challenged. And I think it is really, I like that the project is focusing on thinking about reinsurance. So to me, this is, again, forgetting about performance, and I hope we can talk about that because I'm a contrarian about performance-based payment in these drugs. It's a financing issue that I think we will be able to handle, but we're going to have to do something different on the reinsurance side.
So, a very different perspective. Darrin Gordon is president and CEO of Gordon and Associates. He directed TennCare, the Tennessee Medicaid program, for over a decade, which I think is probably a record tenure in running a state Medicaid
Cyclops in the
program.
land of the blind. The bar was low.
But it's an incredibly challenging thing. Many of the curative therapies that are expected to launch in the next decade, the ones that Colin talked about, are going to be aimed at conditions that are prevalent in the Medicaid population, and that's the population that's the most stressed, the most difficult, I think, financially, to cope with those kinds of challenges. Some of the finance solutions that have been proposed, even if Bob's a skeptic about them, are performance-based payments over time, milestone payments, annuities, things like that. Those kinds of things are particularly challenging, I would think, in Medicaid. So if you can talk a little bit about what the challenges to Medicaid are in general, and in particular, from some of the things that have been posited as solutions.
Sure, absolutely. So, I agree. It's a great time that we find ourselves that we're talking about curative agents. So that's a given. I do agree that, now we're having the discussion, now how do you finance those? And that's where it gets complex. In Medicaid, the benefit you have, why there are those challenges, I do think that Medicaid has, necessity is mother of all invention. And because there's compression on what they can do from a budgetary perspective, it forces them, the Medicaid programs, to be creative in the solutions to the extent they're able within federal regulations. And so, just to put in perspective what that pressure point is where we've seen, I think, Svaldi was the great awakening, I think, for many of us in the Medicaid program, where my Medicaid budget for pharmacy had grown roughly about 1% year over year, which, we were pretty effective in managing that program for quite some time. And when Svaldi hit the scene, it was 10% growth in a single year. And yes, we ran a $12 billion program just in our state alone, and you would think that we'd be able to weather that. But the problem is when I have to ask for additional money to cover that expense, it has to come at the expense of something else. I have to constrain growth elsewhere in the program, and so it is a bit of a give and a take, which gets very complicated because they're not easy choices. But the dynamic that presents itself with many of these curative agents is the issue of, you heard the discussion about individuals not sticking in a self-insured plan for very often. Well, in Medicaid, of the 75 million lives out there, over 70% of them are in managed care, which is, you have insurance companies bearing risk to manage that population. Individuals do tend to move from plan to plan. So when you have a curative agent that requires a great deal of upfront cost, that individual that they invested in, they will not have next year, and it creates some challenges from a financing perspective. Where Medicaid has, in some cases, taken on that risk for those high-cost drugs, it still creates even more complexity, because you have a health plan managing all the physical health services for that particular individual, and presumably reaping some benefit from the curative agent that the state is paying. So again, the dynamics of the financing are distorted. I do think we will figure this out at some point. However, I do think in the interim, while you see a lot of folks moving forward on value-based and performance-based contracting in a lot of areas. Very few have dipped their toe into this specific area because of some of the complexity I just described, but there's many more that hopefully we can get to in the discussion later.
And that brings up something else that I do want to talk about later, which is this notion of portability also of patients moving around, which I think something a lot of people don't think about, but the people who have to deal with it do. Pat Martin is Director of Specialty Network Development at Anthem. Her job involves keeping an eye on emerging therapies and determining how they're going to be covered. Anthem serves, 40 million beneficiaries across a lot of different segments. You've got commercial fully insured, self-funded, Medicare, and Medicaid. So maybe as a baseline, what are the things that are synergies among those different kinds of coverage? And what are the things, maybe a few things that you could highlight that are challenges that are different between them?
Just a few?
Just a few, yeah. Okay. We've got an hour.
Yeah. So first of all, the list of these curative therapies is pretty short. We've heard about some of them that are now being labeled as cures, but we still don't have long-term outcome. But we are saying that they are curative therapies. The list of challenges is probably quadruple and larger in that list, because if you think about an organization like Anthem, it really does take a village of business units in order to make this successful. We have to have stakeholders from our policy department, from our clinical development area. We need to have product involved. We need to listen to our accounts, to hear what's important to them. We need to listen to our providers. City of Hope has been a wonderful partner, with Anthem as we think about these curative therapies and how we're going to address them. We don't have a simple solution. We don't have one answer. But what we have seen there are some synergies across all these lines of business. So what are they? Well, first and foremost is we need to take a look at this as treating the patient along the continuum of care, not just that one therapy. We've heard about all the upfront costs. We've heard about how patients are managed before they get the curative therapy. And then you have to think about that short-term and long-term follow-up, because it does involve both. But we do know that our beneficiaries will move, from one coverage decision to another coverage decision. So we have to be flexible. That's the key synergy across all of these products. Keep our ear to the ground, know what's going on out there in terms of R&D. How can we prepare, to respond when these therapies do come to market so that we have no surprises. Think about our product build and think about reimbursement models. You can find synergies because they will have commonalities. We know the diagnoses that are going to be treated. We know what the regular therapy is for these patients. We need to understand how does the Centers of Excellence impact these members. And again, I think that the challenge of this patient mobility needs to be addressed.
So let's talk about that, the mobility, and maybe start with you, Bob. There's two kinds of mobility. One is if people move physically, but the other is that they're kind of coverage moves. Right. People who, anybody who's been in an organization knows that their employers shift from one company to another. Yeah. Their financial circumstances change. They go into Medicaid. They come out of Medicaid. How do you think about that when you're thinking about a therapy that's going to be very, very expensive, for example, as an employer? It's one thing to think you're going to pay whatever these large amounts of money are for somebody who's then going to be your employee for the rest of their lives. Yeah. But if you think that they might quit next week and go somewhere else, how do you think about that?
Yeah, well, look, nobody sat down at a pad and said employer-sponsored insurance is the smartest way to design a healthcare system. So I think, part of what, but I do think it's here to stay. We have had this discussion about single payer, and we'll see how this one goes. I would sell it short because employer-sponsored insurance does a lot of stuff in the system to keep it going. So it isn't ideal for this. And so I can tell you what won't work, which is if I were to, or any of your companies were to hire an employee, median salary, $60,000, whatever you're going to pay the person, and you then kind of find out that you have years 2, 3, 4, and 5 of a $200,000 payment that had nothing to do with that happened before. Employers are not going to be okay with that. So I think the idea of that kind of multi-year annuity could work at a reinsurance level. There are levels of businesses that could work at. I think that's going to be a real problem. I think basically employers say it's a risk. And yes, this is how it is. I am going to try and get this person healthier with diabetes, for example, but they might be working for my competitor in 4 years. And so you kind of live with the kind of the fact that it's kind of illogical. And so I think, again, it gets back to risk. You're going to have a stop loss or reinsurance. You know that a certain number of catastrophic cases are going to occur. They always do. That's the nature of this game, is 1% of the people are 30 or 40% of the cost. And that is where you would put it in your mind as a category. You don't want to complicate it by paying for someone else's risk when it comes to you.
So another dynamic to think about, I go back to Hep C because this was a conversation we had quite regularly with CMS, is the states were making an investment that ultimately the bulk of the benefit accrued to Medicare. And Medicare was...
Well, I would say the bulk of the benefit actually accrues to the patient who's
Absolutely.
Financial.
I already said that at the very beginning. We're talking about a curative. So that I said that at the very beginning.
Yeah.
I said, let's accept that we're in a great place in that regard. Then you have to think about the financing side because that's what we're focused on.
Yeah.
I can go back to the beginning. We can
I'm sorry.
reiterate that. If I need to reiterate that every time, I'll be happy to do that. But that's the thing we're struggling with. Because in Medicaid, it isn't getting them access to the drug. Because if the pharmaceutical company does the mandatory regulatory rebate, the drug is covered instantaneously. We can't delay whatsoever. So from our perspective, the access part is somewhat resolved in that regard, and that creates challenges. And I'll just say, in that states are having to react versus plan in how they're going to set up their coverage criteria or negotiate creative arrangements. But in the instance where we have a situation where we have another government payer that isn't engaging, that we're making this investment here, and it's one that is again, it's not done in a silo. It's done. You're making this decision to do this because it's the right thing to do. But let me be very clear: it's at the expense of things we're covering for other people in the program. And so you have to have Medicare in that particular example. And again, we've talked about there's a lot of the movement. It looks different in a variety of different ways. But in that case, I do find I always get a little frustrated that, in government, sometimes we create our own chaos, that we have all these multiple silos of healthcare programs that subsidize healthcare coverage for individuals at different stages of their life. And we need to think about it as it relates to these curative agents. Let's rise up above the silo effect and think about that, at least within the government construct, and how we can be more intelligent about funding those.
So is that part of it then to say really the cost shouldn't all be shifted 100% onto Medicaid? People are going to go from Medicaid to Medicare, and Medicare should reach back a little bit now.
Depending on what the agent is. In some cases it won't, but in a lot of cases, that we're looking at, particularly for a disabled population or age blend disabled population, that is true.
Pat?
Yeah, I think these are all really great comments, and it does reinforce that we need people to work together, that everybody needs to be at the table to understand what their perspective is and how can we collectively come up with a solution. to have one solution over here and one solution over there, it makes it extremely difficult for us to truly be effective in identifying the right patients, getting them the right therapy, and making sure that the providers are reimbursed fairly.
And that brings up the providers. And you mentioned an interesting thing in your introductory remarks also, is that the providers, especially ones like City of Hope that have been involved in developing these therapies, they've got costs that they've been absorbing all along.
Most certainly so, and I think one of the things that drive us is that we see a lot of patients for whom there are unmet needs. And if you look at cancer overall, a third of patients diagnosed today won't survive. So part of our mission is to ensure that for those individuals for whom standard of care is insufficient, that we're invested in creating new cures. I think we also, going back to what Dr. Van Vliet said earlier, we don't want these things to be abstractions. We don't want just papers. The commodity of success for us is actually lives that are changed. And I think the way to do that, the panelists have really articulated well, which is for so long we've existed in these different silos. I think by forming partnerships that do a couple of things, to some extent share risk, to some extent ensure that practice is done in a way which respects great stewardship of what can be really high-cost pharmaceuticals. In as much as we love partnerships with Anthem and others who allow us to work in a sustainable way, part of our duty in that partnership is to make sure we're giving these therapies to the right patients, that those for whom a research product is more appropriate, we do that. So we have to be smart and invested, and that involves a level of knowledge transparency and partnership that hasn't existed before. So my institution is looking at ways of doing this differently. And in fact, I now have a role in employer strategy where we work with employers to kind of think about, here's the 0.4% of people within your population for whom standard of care may not be enough and for whom we have to think really differently. And that involves listening a lot more than we've ever done historically.
So, Jim, go.
I wanted to add a little bit too. I know we're talking about financing. However, the thing is too is within the hemophilia population, you also have to understand that they went through a lot in the 80s with the HIV epidemic, with the infected blood and derivatives. So, 90% of the men with hemophilia contracted had HIV, and also then there was Hep C along with that. But then also about 50% of them died. So to think about these curative therapies, you have to kind of pause a little bit, because it's not just a given that somebody with hemophilia will just automatically demand that therapy. There's a lot of excitement, but there's cautious optimism. And that does have a financial impact, right? When they're pausing a little bit and thinking, do I want this therapy? What about the next therapy? What are these therapies going to do to me? What's the long-term effect? Any side effects? If this doesn't work, do I have the opportunity for another? If I do have the opportunity for another, how many years of clearance does that have to take? So I'm not a clinician, but at the same point, those are some of the things that will be going through their minds.
It's really complicated. So sticking with the hemophilia example and contrasting it maybe, in the hemophilia it seems in the financing issues, in some ways it's more stark because whoever's paying for it now knows generally what the therapies cost. They're extraordinarily expensive, and they know that those costs, they can project them going forward. If they think that they have a durable therapy, they know what they're offsetting. That's one issue. Then there are other kinds of therapies where the financial offset is not as stark. For example, something that's curing a non-deadly disease, blindness. I mean, there's nothing more magic than making somebody see who hasn't seen before, but it doesn't create an automatic financial offset. How do you, all of you, how do you think about those two differences, and do they present different kinds of challenges for you? Bob?
Yeah, I think they're two very different issues, and it is great when you can have, like with Hep C, when they're truly curative, you really can do a kind of economic model and you can see the value, but they're frequently not. And I think that that's a societal discussion. I don't think that that is a discussion that we can fix in the employer world or the commercial world or the Medicare or Medicaid or any world, right? That is really what's the value? What is the incremental value? We're not talking about that kind of stuff today, but if we were, I would basically say it would have something to do with how much are we going to pay as a society for this, and when are we going to say no? And I think we have decided in this country that we're a wealthy country and we don't want to say no. So I don't do ROIs and ROI, and I don't do any of that with any of my companies. I did that when I was a younger pup and starting to do kind of business and healthcare. I don't do that anymore, because if it is FDA approved and the best physicians in the country, at centers of excellence, which I strongly believe in, like City of Hope, think this is it and the patient wants it, then it's a matter of kind of what's the right price for this and how do we finance it. So I think they're two very different discussions.
Darrin?
No, I totally agree. I mean, again, the way it works, I touched on it briefly in the Medicaid context. I mean, we're the safety net system for the country. And so there's a lot of rationale, and it makes total sense of why that, if a pharmaceutical company offers an agent that's FDA approved and they're willing to meet the regulatory requirements around rebates, that it's instantaneously covered. So we don't get into an issue from that context. What we do try to think through is our system set up in a way to make sure that from a financial perspective, that as it goes down throughout the system, that we are cognizant if there are offsets. Each state's a little bit different, but more times than not, a lot of the programs are still siloed within the Medicaid agency itself, and different services are carved out, different populations are carved out of different programs, which makes that trying to understand, am I approaching this in a way that makes sense for how I have my program structured? That you do that kind of analysis, but beyond that, we're not sitting there, saying what ROI is. I will tell you, we do have that discussion on some of the more costly agents. Again, in the context where I'm having to make that decision, I have to cover it, but I have to take something else away. But then thinking about, if it's not within my program where the silos are creating issues, is it, like in the context of Medicare, is that a challenge? But I'll tell you, I want to go back to something that was said earlier, which is absolutely on point. While we've done a lot with value-based purchasing and looking at how we can change some of the dynamics in the system, which is complicated in and of itself, when a lot of discussion where people are, I think, hopeful. I mean, I think we're in the embryonic stages of that in every area. In pharmacy, we're still not even really have many models we can point to. There's a couple, but I think the issue of the interaction with the provider in that situation is a very different interaction that we've had before, which is good. I think it's positive direction, so I think it will help in a variety of different contexts. But when you're talking about getting information and data, from a performance perspective, it's not typically the type of data and performance information that's been exchanged with the payer world. So I think that's going to be helpful, but that creates a lot of stretching as well. I think how we engage the members, particularly as you're saying that there's some concern of even accessing some of the therapies. So it's stretching us in new ways. I think ultimately positive ways, because thinking of new ways to interact and form partnerships with providers, thinking of new ways to engage members and member education, all those are good. I will tell you, I had 1.5 million enrollees. It's not easy, by no means, but at least this is starting to generate, I think, somewhat of a call to action to make everyone concentrate a little bit harder about how they can be creative about approaching those issues.
I apologize for interrupting, but one of the things that I've enjoyed in these conversations, I have yet to have anybody say make it cheaper. What's great is when you hear. Well, you have to be the first.
I think you've got some calls for it here.
Now's the moment.
But that's not what people articulate as their highest priority. I think whether it's payers or employers, as they speak with their members and they speak with their beneficiaries, the burden of illness is apparent, even though it may not get factored into pricing or valuation or ROI. You're there on the front line speaking to people with these relationships, when they're suffering, and the burden of illness is very, very transparent to you. So when we work in these discussions, often the first thing is make it effective and make sure that this issue of patient-centeredness, which has a value on a lot of levels, that becomes part of the process. And the financing around patient-centeredness is a separate question and the valuation around that, but it's got to be central to these discussions as well, because when you're talking about finance, patient-centeredness, reduction in the burden of illness, all those things, quality of life, restoration of functionality, those things don't easily lend themselves to an ROI calculation, but they are real.
And the data is not always collected, and that makes it extremely difficult. We don't really have national databases that they're required to report outcomes to, where we would be able to go and collectively look at that data. And it should be, across all payers, across all systems. If we all contributed, then we would have a much more robust, data center. But I think another thing, and we've touched on patient mobility a few times here, is there a way that we could work across all of our collective, perspectives to mitigate that risk, to say, what is the advantage of you moving here if we have this? What are the things that we can do that would sort of equal, sort of level the playing field? Are there ways that we can keep beneficiaries within a system for a longer period of time?
We're here in Washington, and for better or worse, so I want to ask all of you to maybe think a little bit about if you had the magic wand and you could get HHS, CMS to make changes, if you could get Congress to make changes. What are there regulatory barriers? Are there legislative or administrative fixes, absent just pouring huge amounts more money into the system, that would reduce the challenges to finance these kind of curative therapies? Darrin, I see you shaking your head. Let's start with you.
I mean, there are, and we can debate, are they real or are they perceived? Regardless, it has done in some of the conversations, and how to finance these things differently. For example, Medicaid best price. I mean, there is an argument to be made that, to the extent that a creative arrangement's entered into and that performance for a patient is not achieved, then, and they get zero reimbursement for that, that is now the new threshold.
Can you just back up and explain it just a little bit more in case everybody isn't?
So Medicaid best price, where a manufacturer will have to ensure that the safety net program Medicaid is in essence getting the best deal. That's the easiest way to describe it. And so the fear by some of the manufacturers in entering into some more creative arrangements, again, I think there is an argument to be made that there needs to be some clarity added to Medicaid best price. But if that manufacturer for anyone, whether it's in Medicaid or in the commercial space, entered into a creative arrangement where they had some performance requirements around that particular agent, and those were not achieved for an individual. Doesn't mean everyone in that insurer, but just a single individual. And so therefore zero payment was made, or let's say it's 10% of what that agent normally costs. It doesn't matter. That could be argued to be the low price that they must now offer to Medicaid across all 75 million population. So that's a bit concerning, and that obviously throws some water on the discussions about some of these creative solutions. I think another situation that comes in, is, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. It is one of the more complicated areas to do these types of arrangements. Another area that comes up is anti-kickback, particularly if you're doing some kind of arrangements with some of the providers around some of these curative agents. And I think in both of those, there can be safe harbors, and there just needs to be clarity in updating some of these regulations. They're updating anti-kickback in a lot of other areas because the world has changed. I think they just need more specific language as it relates to what manufacturers and, quite frankly, payers are wanting to do in this particular space. Give them that space to be creative.
And I think, hold on, because I think later in the day we're going to hear from some politicians who've got some ideas about changing those. But any of the rest of you about regulatory or legislative changes best price or anti-kickback or any other issues you think that are important?
I just globally, when I read through the IPPS rule and get an enormous headache doing so, and ask God for a different job in that moment, what stands out is that CMS and the government haven't really come about to the idea that the stuff we're talking about today is really different. So a rule that works great in a general medical surgical population, or that even works well for the large portion of patients in oncology who are well served by a standard of care, these things are really different. And I think CMS would do well to use its convening authority to come up with a differentiated payment system where they get the stakeholders, the key ones, working within a construct that has to evolve to come up with a differentiated payment system for products and services that are deeply differentiated from everything we've had to date. If you don't do that, and you're trying to use a payment system that doesn't work well in this space, the mismatches are going to grow, and patients will unfortunately be disenfranchised from access. And that's the worst of all possible worlds. So I get that. I guess that would be my magical wand, is have CMS say, these things are really different. We got to treat them differently.
One of the things that contributes to that, first of all, we need better coding.
Absolutely.
We are not doing a very good job on the coding issue. But it is also the site of service. Mm-hmm. So we have some centers that perform, treatment A in the inpatient, mm-hmm. and then you go across the street or down the street, and they're doing it in the outpatient setting. So the site of service can be different at different institutions, but could also change halfway through a treatment at the same center. And that really is a financing and reimbursement challenge.
Mm-hmm. Bob, it looked like you wanted to.
Yes, you're assuming function here here because
we've got the magic wand,
yeah,
so we can do that.
Yeah, look, I think it depends what scenario happens. And again, I thought that last talk was so interesting because if you kind of took some of the scenarios that you find something for a highly prevalent disease, Alzheimer's or diabetes, and you're in a different world than adding $30 or $40 billion. Now you're into a world where the federal government really has a role. They've done it before. They've done it in dialysis. They've done it in flood insurance. So if you really were to face, and it really is uniquely different, this kind of the gene therapies and cell therapies, you could see a case where you have models where you have a federal involvement. The problem with the state pools, which is, again, we're talking about reinsurance, and pools is they're always underfunded because states have to balance budgets. And so the history of trying to pool this at a state level has been that it's underfunded. The problem with trying to pool it commercially like they're trying to do in Massachusetts is free riderism, which is kind of, everyone's going, well, I'll let them pay. And so they generally don't work. So that's why the federal government can, and I'm a market person, but I think the federal government has a true role in certain situations, and this could be one of them. Would it become a gigantic cost where you could have a way of capturing it in the way they did dialysis and some other treatments?
So basically the government stepped in and said end-stage renal disease dialysis for that is going to be terribly expensive. It's life-preserving, it's essential, and we're going to step in and we're going to make sure that everybody can afford it.
Yeah, and look at how it evolved. We're going to pay some of it. Commercially, you're going to pay first for the first couple of years, then we're going to take it. Then as that became too expensive, they kept the risk but gave a lot of it back to private companies to become more efficient, to do some interesting managed care stuff and disease management like the DaVitas of the world. So it was a kind of a nice story of kind of the government working and the private sector working together.
I'm going to ask another question or two, but then I want to tee it up so that we have plenty of time for you and the audience. If you have questions, please go to one of the microphones, and please do have questions. And I'll just have one or two more questions.
Yeah, I wanted to add definitely changing regulations, federal and state level, would be key. I think what's exciting, and me being a part of New Digs along with my colleague, Don Rodolini, is just the fact that some of these financing models, for a market solution could really be great if those regulations would be eased up a bit to allow for it. Because obviously we're at the beginning of these therapies, and down the road this will be the norm. So hemophilia, men with hemophilia and a few women and those carriers that have mild hemophilia, I mean, they know they're expensive. The therapy that's currently there, thank God we have a therapy with the factor concentrate, but they understand that. But they've also had trouble getting jobs, keeping their employment and so forth. And so if you imagine that this becomes the norm, it's not hemophilia that will stick out. Actually, it'll be a blend of multiple chronic conditions that have therapies that would be the norm to implement. And the idea then with employers, the hope is that they obviously financing is a big issue, but they won't just look at that because of that being the norm. It's the new norm down the road. But those regulations have to ease up to be able to do that.
There's another thing to think about from the regulatory perspective, and I touched on it briefly. Because of the immediate coverage of a new agent that's FDA approved, states have to start covering something before they have the information that the FDA looked at to approve it. So all of a sudden you're putting in a very bad spot where your coverage criteria may be allowing for the agent to be used for folks for which there's no evidence that it's a benefit, which is not a good situation to be with finite resources. But it also, in some cases, a pharmaceutical company may or may not want to engage in a creative funding mechanism because you have to cover their drug regardless. You have to make it available. However, I would say, there's probably some ability for states who do have preferred drug lists to make it a condition to be on their preferred drug list, but it's kind of hard when there's not a competing agent to have that ability to engage in that regard. So I think there's some changes that could be done there, and I quite frankly, allowing manufacturers to engage, whether it's in the commercial space or in the Medicaid space or Med Advantage space. Well, maybe it's not Med Advantage space, it really won't matter with the current construct, but allow them to gauge early on, even before FDA approval, so that you're not reacting to something and immediately covering it, but being able to talk about different arrangements that may be beneficial for the manufacturer, but also for these programs to be able to offer these as effectively as they can.
So that's something that I've heard before, and I've heard people argue both sides of it. People saying, well, the companies are constrained, they can't talk about investigational products with payers. I've had a lot of prominent attorneys in Washington tell me that that's actually not true and that they actually can. I've had the FDA commissioner tell me that that's not true. They're not going to stop them from doing that.
Then write a letter and just clarify it, and then we'll be done.
Is it in your experience, Darrin, Pat, Bob, is that a hurdle? Do you really find that companies aren't going to talk to you about investigational products before they're launched and you're just surprised by them?
It's a hurdle, whether perceived or not. It has been a hurdle because that is what they've used and why they haven't engaged with us. So I've seen the exact same communication saying this shouldn't be an issue. And sometimes, whether it's perceived or real, if everyone says, particularly the regulating bodies, are saying that this is an issue, then I think writing something to clarify that will allow us at least to move past that one particular issue.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think that there is a reluctance, to talk about it. Not our experience, at least with some companies, not all companies, is that they're willing to find a path, to have that discussion. So the letter writing, the clarification, something that'll open the door. I think we also need guardrails of what's going to be discussed and how that's going to be shared.
Questions?
The consequences for if they're just unsure, I get it as a company, are too large. The risks are too large.
Can we still fantasize about the government?
So I thought
I actually find the idea that the Secretary put forth about looking to price in this country the way things are priced in Western Europe to be intriguing. And so a lot more work needs to be done to hash that out. But I certainly am not on curative therapies now, but especially in specialty drugs, which many of us on the payer side have been very focused on for a few years because it's been driving our cost trend. the disparity between what we pay in this country and what is paid in very wonderful countries where people are really healthy in Western Europe is really dramatic. And so closing that gap and doing it on the basis of value, again, not the theme of today, but it is, kind of, I think a lot of us who pay are straining, to be able to talk about that. That's a very interesting potential policy. Needs a lot more work, but I think would like to see a lot more work done there.
So now I'd like to invite in, if there's anybody in the audience has questions. If not, I'll pick you out, because I know some of you. There. Steve Pearson's got it.
Hi. Steve Pearson at ICER. Bob, I'm not even going to swing at the slow pitch, but I appreciate it. I appreciate it. No need to offshore what we can do here at home. That's my mantra. So it's clearly illogical to think that we shouldn't look for new approaches to pay when we have a science and an ability to care for patients that really is transformative. So all of this and this energy and effort is really important. And my hat's really off to Mark and the other folks at New Digs. But I'm also struck by the fact that we could spend the entire day here talking about curative therapies and not really know what that means. And in some of the discussions that we've had around this topic with innovators, life science companies, and payers, I'd like to ask you the similar question, which is, if we're going to create a track for, let's say, some form of amortization of payment, what are we talking about? Does it really have to be a cure? What does that mean? What if it's a one-time treatment that provides a substantial benefit for patients but isn't curative? It doesn't make them completely healthy. What if it's a device that's implanted that has the same kind of health benefit, but it's a device? Or an organ transplantation, in a sense, is a one-time treatment for a lifetime of benefit, and yet we're not talking about that.
So really,
and what about cures for non-lethal conditions? So we have a cure for psoriasis or for rheumatoid arthritis. So where do we draw the boundaries if there are unintended consequences, and many people feel that there will be? What are we talking about around methods to identify what should be exceptionally paid for? I'd appreciate your thoughts.
So in my kind of add-on to that question is are we really talking about curative therapies because they're curative, or are we talking about them because they're extraordinarily expensive? And I think that's basically what Steve Pearson was asking.
Yeah. Expensive.
So it doesn't matter if they're curative. If they were curative and they didn't cost much, we wouldn't have this discussion.
Yeah, I think Steve raises a good point, which is what are we talking about? I think you articulated it right. And so I think what we're talking about is something that's very, very high cost. Remember, we haven't talked about it, but people with median incomes of $60,000 are straining to pay their healthcare costs. Companies, and these companies I'm managing are mid-market companies. They're not gigantic like GE. They have 1,200 employees. These costs are really a very, very big deal to them in terms of their profitability. So those pressures kind of do lead you to find something to do about these very, very high price tag. That's why I started with the reinsurance and got into billing. So to me, and again, it is all about patients. It totally is about that. But people can't pay. Their wages aren't going up because they're paying so much for health care. So the very high price tag, I think, is the issue, and how can we either amortize it or find a reinsurance way to spread the risk and get a tertiary market or something, as long as we're going to pay these price tags.
Totally agree. I mean, the struggle is the current system in which we pay for health care hasn't been set up to deal with things of this price tag well. I mean, we've struggled through it over the years for certain things, but I think it's like I talked about Hep C being such a game changer in a lot of ways, from the curative aspects, but it was the cost that really, when you're having a conversation that we were having about what services are we not going to be able to offer in order to do this, it was purely on the price issue, whether it's curative or not. That's what really caused the disruption.
I want to move on so we get as many questions as we can.
Sure. Bruce Goldberg, Lyle Biotech. I wanted to ask the panel about this issue of patient mobility and and portability, and following on exactly what you just said. So it's my understanding that we have some lessons learned from Sovaldi and Hep C, and people like you looked at it in that way, and Kaiser looked at it and they said, it's a bargain. We'll pay for it immediately as soon as possible, bring them all. So what are we going to do here? There's obviously a solution, it's a design solution to the fragmentation, but how do we get to
Yeah,
that?
but wasn't that a one-off? I mean, to me, I thought that was a fantastic, it was one-off in two ways. One, it was really curative, and the numbers were clear. You know, that at a certain price point, it really was cost-effective, A. And B, you had competitors come in really fast. So you could actually have the market work. And we were paying European rates within, I don't know, some PBM would have to tell me, a fairly short period of time.
So
right? So I mean, I love that example. And so to me, that is a strata when you have a drug that's curative and you can quantify it, and there are competitors too.
Sure, but
so that's my only issue
I'd push
with
back
that.
on it being a one-off because Kaiser did at the moment it was $1,000. They weren't looking at a price decrease, and the gentleman next to you had to look at it and say, what else can I not offer my patients? If I'm
I
gonna
guess
offer this?
one-off because it was curative. You knew how much it cost to do transplants.
Yeah.
I've looked at probably 50 of these compounds. It's hard. I think hemophilia is a very good example where you can do that kind of cost effectiveness and figure it out. There's so many that aren't. It adds 3 months of life. It adds 6 months of this kind of quality of life. Those are much more difficult to me than Hep C. I had so many patients with Hep C. I mean, it goes away, you know, and you can quantify how much a transplant is. That's what I meant. So maybe not a one-off as much as a strata that has been the minority in my experience.
And just to be clear, the agent was covered immediately. I mean, that's not, I mean, that wasn't even, or, you know, we didn't spend any time on that discussion. The discussion is because we have to think in 12-month budget windows and a constitutional requirement we can't spend more than what we bring in as a state. I mean, then I have to figure out what I'm not going to do or what I'm going to scale back on so that I can do what I'm required to do, which we want to do.
Or to limit the number of people who get it the first year.
And that gets back to that challenge where, you know, you have to cover it day one before you even have the evidence that was used to get approval. And that's why, you know, there's been a lot of discussions that we've had on MACPAC, where we advise Congress, the White House, and states on Medicaid, where we've been having that very issue is, can you have time to make sure that you're ensuring the coverage criteria gets to the population that it's proven to benefit?
Yes, thank you. Lena Chaihorsky from Alva 10. Thanks so much for such a great panel. Question for you all around how you're thinking about the concept of precision medicine as a lever and as a pushback mechanism. Because it continues to strike me that as we're having these conversations, either curative therapies or expensive therapies, we take as the underlying presumption the line given to us by pharma or the therapy company of what a candidate is defined as, right? However the pharmaceutical company defines a candidate is how we immediately start thinking about the financial impact. And to the previous gentleman's point, there is an incredible capacity for diagnostic technology today to understand and delineate the mechanisms of action that empower us to ask the question and challenge the pharmaceutical industry and say, is this the absolutely correct candidate pool? And then start having the financial conversation. So to what extent have you guys battled with that internally in your organizations, and any takeaways?
Yes, so I think what you ask is wonderful, because I think genomic testing and all these things are changing how we approach medicine. I think it's caused us to realign ourselves as an institution. So what we've done is created disease teams, and we have an affiliate, actually, it's TGen, where we can get data based upon genomics. And what we find is that in as much as we learn that patients may benefit from a targeted therapeutic, we also learn in many instances they won't. We learn about patients for whom no adjuvant chemotherapy for early stage breast cancer that might have normally received it, they're better off with less therapy. So I think what we tried to do is look through two lenses. One is, what do emerging learnings tell us about best and optimum practice? The other thing is that because we're in a heavily managed care market, we've had to look through this value-based prism, and to us that means right therapy for the right patient in the right care setting. So genomics has allowed us to do something that somebody referred to in the first panel, which is segment the population at a level that we've never been able to do before. So I think ICD-10 codes are a rubbish way to do it. If you can look at patients in a much more precise way, then you can align therapy for the right patient, and just as often you save money.
And I think also just quickly to comment, there's a financial opportunity there as well, right? Because we can also say, look, if there's a smaller population, maybe that's the opportunity for the drug company, and it's
Yes.
not this more all-comer population. Sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't wanna-
look, we like that. We use, you're talking about really precision diagnostics.
Yes.
And there aren't as many as I wish there were, but they
Me too.
are baked into every one of our company's prior auth with whatever pharmacy benefit manager we're using. And so I think that is important. I've been disappointed at how many there are in 2019 versus how many I thought there would be when I read about this in '08. But there are some, and I think they're really important.
There's a question.
Well, I think, Tim, you wanted to say something?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
With the hemophilia community, we have the Centers of Excellence with the federally recognized hemophilia treatment centers. National Hemophilia Foundation, where I'm at, we have our MASAC, which is our medical advisory and scientific.
Advisory.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Medical and Scientific Advisory Council. So with that in mind, then many of them are participating at their hemophilia treatment centers and the clinical studies and so forth. So and they specialize in this area. So there's great centers with top minds that can really kind of hone that in. Obviously not for every disease state that exists, but for us, we're fairly confident with that.
Absolutely.
Hi, Michelle Rice with the National Hemophilia Foundation. So we are, in our opinion, we would say we are one of those communities that individualized medicine is very specific to. I mean, we're a small population. Patients respond differently without really understanding why they respond differently. And we do have our hemophilia treatment centers, and our patients are very engaged with the centers. However, as Tim mentioned earlier, in a patient population where, they were decimated by HIV, by Hep C, they have become a very cautious patient population. They've experienced loss of a job as soon as someone found out they had hemophilia. We are doing a lot to educate our community on the fact that now is the time with all this innovation, now is the time to really be willing to share your information, but it is very frightening to them because they fear having that target or they've experienced having that target on their back before. But this is something that we have been working on for the last several years in bringing together payers, providers, the patient voice to say, how can we work together to establish, what are the right metrics to be looking at for cost effectiveness and for good patient outcomes and keeping the patient centric. And we continue to have this conversation with our patients, but I love that there's this conversation about we should be having more conversation together, we should be talking together more, but I just want to say from a patient perspective how scary that can be, especially in our patient population. So there is a little bit of fear about exposing yourself that much.
So as one of the public policy solutions is needed some kind of safe harbor for patients.
Well, there is one. There's anti-discrimination law. So when people get fired because of that, which they unfortunately still do, not in my companies, but there is law, right? So I think there is good public policy, just needs to be enforced.
Problem is it's at will states, and most people don't say they're firing you for that reason.
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah,
That's what I'm
yeah.
saying when I say it shouldn't, but it does, and I agree. So to the extent there are holes in that public policy, it's odious, and so that stuff.
We're running out of time. If there is a question or two more, glad to have it. Otherwise, maybe we've got a few minutes left. I'd just like to go down the line and see if anybody, if all of you want to make a kind of a parting comment from your perspective of, if we're coming back here in a year, what would you like to see different? What do you expect to see different? Pat.
I'd like us to come back with solutions. That's what I would like us, to do. And I think that we can get to solutions if we continue this type of conversation with the right stakeholders at the table to look across a unique patient population.
I think I agree totally on solutions. I think there are some creative things that are brewing out there, and I think to the extent that you could elevate those so that broader audiences understand and appreciate what some of those arrangements look like. In some cases, they're not allowed to share, which isn't helpful. But to the extent that we broaden the collective intelligence about some of those innovators that are out front in this, that that may help spur further innovation and spread to broader payers as well as providers, so that we can continue to improve access.
Yeah, my hope would be, I think employers and payers have kind of got off the rails the way they're using copays and coinsurance in these kind of treatments. I mean, there was a philosophical reason that you did kind of copayments and high deductibles, and none of them had to do with these kind of therapies. I mean, it had to do with you should share in the cost, and it should decrease inappropriate care because it costs a little more, and when consumerism was in vogue, it would make you want to shop, none of which apply to these kind of illnesses. So it's just a misapplied concept, and so we have gotten rid of it in my companies, and I'm just hoping that we can get everyone in the commercial space to do that. It doesn't make any sense.
I think from my vantage point, it's continuing to have the patient and the patient advocacy organization's voice. They can actually contribute quite a lot to the ideas because they're the ones receiving the treatment, the therapy. They're the ones that it's being done for as well. And so you'll be surprised with the feedback that's given by community members, how solutions can come about, and how some of the barriers can be acknowledged as to why they are a barrier. So.
I think one of the things that comes out here, in addition to forming these partnerships, is that data is really going to make a difference to patients and families and to payers and everyone. And one of the things I can do in the allogeneic transplant space is I can go by every transplant center in the country and tell you exactly what their one-year survival is and what their one-year survival is by diagnosis. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do that for CAR T cells. There's 69 centers in the country doing these therapeutics. There's no reason why we shouldn't have that level of data transparency. And as you move into these therapeutics for rare diseases, it seems like a necessity is creating that data transparency. That way patients can feel and create a sense of trust by having access to data, but everyone up here would benefit by that level of transparency, I think.
Well, thanks very much. It's really an interesting discussion. We could stay up here all day, but I think we've got to leave some room for some others. Thank you.
Thank you very much.